University and Tampere Peace Research Institute.
Swati Parashar from School of Global Studies, Gothenburg University in Sweden. Thank you.
Nompumelelo Motlafi from the University of South Africa and a student at the University of Pretoria.
We're missing Annick, right? Because I was waiting for her. But anyways, Itziar Mujika Chao from the University of the Basque Country, Political Science Department and EWA Institute for International Cooperation and Development Studies.
Hi, everyone. Hello from the Australian National University. My name is Maria Tanyag, and I'm a lecturer at the Department of International Relations.
I just received a message from Annick. She is having tech issues. She's joining as soon as possible. And so I'm going to introduce her. Oh, there you go. You introduce yourself. Hello, Annick.
Hi. I'm Annick. I am at the Swedish Defense University, and I have the title of the Anna Lind Professor for Gender. I'm very excited to be here.
The connection is really not good. I could not really hear Annick, but maybe it's going to get better later.
Yeah.
So Catia, would you like to start? What we thought of doing today is have a short introductions from Catia Confortini and me, Tarja Väyrynen, about the kind of history and origins of this book. And then we would move to a roundtable where we have a couple of questions prepared for our esteemed colleagues who contributed to the handbook. So Catia, would you like to start about saying a couple of words about the history of this handbook?
Yes, thank you, Tarja. So this book, this handbook comes really in the it's one of the legacies of the initiative of the Feminist Peace Research Network, but it has moved beyond that. The Feminist Peace Research Network started a few years ago when actually on social media, the first product was a called Tampere, and a series of conferences held in different Nordic countries that put together feminist researchers in different disciplines, but they had in common this concern for reshaping, re-intervening in peace research. Sometime later, Tarja was approached by Routledge, and the network expanded in various ways, and this project came about. So since the beginning, we thought of it as a collaborative process where as a number of editors would really try to cast a wide net on what this field could envision itself as. And we see this handbook with all the different sections, and Tarja will talk a little bit more about it, as really the beginning of a conversation about this big project that we see as feminist peace research. Our intention is to intervene as feminists wherever questions of justice and peace are relevant, which is quite a big net. I think I'll leave it at that because I don't want to take too much time from the substantive contributions of our author. And Tarja, if you want to kind of go into the substance of the handbook.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Catia. I'm not going to describe the substance and the subsections in Handbook in detail, but I would say a couple of words about the process, how we kind of initiated the structure of the book, and some of the cross-cutting themes we thought would be vital for this type of book. And kind of history, genealogy of feminist peace research was one of the first things we thought of immediately when we embarked on this project. And the reason for this is that often the history of peace research is written without any reference to feminist research and female scholars, or scholars in more general who do feminist theorizing, feminist research. So we thought that that would be an important component in addition to the methodological discussions, meaning that that we would in this book embrace the multiple methods which are embedded in feminist research in more general. Of course, we also wanted to include some institutional elements there. And one of the key themes through which we wanted to look at those was the continuum between peace and violence. We thought that we should not ask the authors to define peace and violence, but rather to explore the different forms of peaces and different forms of violences, and discuss those in the light of continuum those form. And maybe the third point I would like to mention about the content of the research and how we enrolled the writers was the kind of the multiplicity of case studies they have done in their research career. So we wanted also to illustrate these theoretical and conceptual issues through case studies, sound empirical case studies, and through critical discussions. So basically, that was all I wanted to say about the content of the book, and I know our esteemed panelists have more to say about what they did in the book, in peace research. So Catia, would you like to ask the first question we carefully thought of posing to our
yes,
panelists?
I was trying to find the button to unmute myself. So I guess that the first questions we would like to pose is about the challenges you faced. Well, actually, no, that was the second question. Sorry. I told you that I wasn't as prepared for this panel. We wanted to ask what feminist peace research means to you in light of your chapter and research. And I get, maybe we can start with Itziar. I'm just going to go through my list as they appear to me. What does feminist peace research mean to you in light of your chapter? Your and Iker as well.
Okay, thank you, Catia. So in our chapter, we looked at, well, titled Development and Foreign Aid. We kind of tried to look at the gender dynamics of development and international cooperation and aid, right? And here we thought a lot about, that's a question that it constantly appears in our work. we're constantly looking, at least in our case, we're constantly looking at those tools that the Global North identifies as peaceful, as means for peace building, and seeing how they provoke quite the opposite thing, right? How they result to be violent for a lot of communities, and how a feminist and the post-colonial perspective is completely necessary in order to disentangle all these complexities and nuances that are behind the concept and the practice of peace and peace building, right? So here we look, we initially tried to look at the gender, at the insertion of women initially, then gender, but what we specifically wanted to do was to look at funding, right? And how funding also shapes and gives form to what we identify as the peace work or everyday work behind the peace building machineries, right? How does money, how does funding contribute to create violence or to create peace, and how do all those organizations behind this peace building and funding machineries function? How do they have to adapt? How do they have to work under all these circumstances, to say it somehow, right? So we also focused on that. We wanted to focus on the local level to see how all those global dynamics affect all those, in this case, organizations. We chose to focus on organizations, women's organizations, how they see their everyday life affected, right?
Thank you. Élise, do you want to say something about your chapter? How, what does feminist peace research meant to you as you were writing yours? And I have to note that Élise is also one of my co-conspirators and editors.
Yeah, well, thank you, Catia, and thank you, everyone. Well, I wrote a chapter on gender and diaspora, and what really interested me to write on in this chapter was to write on how feminist peace research and diaspora studies have benefited from one another. And in particular, what I'm trying to explore in the chapter is how feminist peace approaches to diasporas have helped challenging essentialist conceptualizations of diaspora groups, because diaspora groups are usually presented as relatively homogeneous and with identities determined by their country of origin. And in opposition to these stereotypical views, feminist peace approaches highlight the diversity, but also the contradictions, tensions, opposing interests, the power relations, and so on that exist in diaspora groups. So in that sense, a feminist peace approach, as applied to diaspora studies, strongly relies on an intersectional perspective that pays attention both to individual and collective positionalities and how these determine relations of power within diaspora groups. And in turn, I think that diaspora studies have furthered, in my view, feminist understandings of concepts such as hybridity, diversity, or queerness, which are crucial for understanding diasporas. So a feminist peace research approach to diaspora is also, I think, about complexifying simplistic but often heard statements about gender relations in diaspora settings, which tend to present diaspora settings as overly patriarchal and traditional. So for instance, we hear often that certain women who do not fulfill their traditional, quote unquote, task to reproduce the nation or the ethnic group in a diaspora setting, then if they don't do that, other diaspora members and men in particular perceive the very existence of the diaspora as being jeopardized. But at the same time, feminist peace research has also shown that diaspora settings could constitute spaces of emancipation for women. And in parallel, to give you like another example of this, how these stereotypes have been countered by feminist peace research as applied to diaspora studies, in parallel, research has also shown that on the one hand, men living in diaspora groups can be empowered by patriarchal norms valued in countries of origin, especially in personal and domestic spaces, but at the same time that they could be disempowered in the wider society because of negative attitudes and stereotypes about non-white masculinities. But in my view, one of the most promising outcomes of the nexus between feminist peace approaches and diaspora studies has been to highlight the domination of normative heterosexuality in most political and policy discourses about diaspora. It has also, I think, underscored the fact that normative heterosexuality structures, to a certain extent, relations within diaspora groups themselves, and justifying aggression towards diasporic sexual minorities because they are seen as a threat to the image or to the reputation of the diaspora group as a whole. And in that sense, the affirmation of a sexual identity can be a way for people of all genders living in the diaspora to reject both, on the one hand, Orientalist and colonial stereotypes, but also, on the other hand, traditional communal expectations. So on the whole, studying diaspora settings, and this is what I'm trying to show in the chapter, how when you study diaspora through a feminist peace lens, then you help reveal those very deeply entrenched patterns of gendered violence within many diaspora groups, which are more often than not triggered by the context in the countries of settlement. And it also shows the everydayness and the mundane character of this violence. And by demonstrating how power structures and gender relations within diaspora settings are built at that very complex intersection of race, class, religion, and so on, feminist approaches have helped, in my opinion, to improve how we understand diaspora groups. And it has also shown, and I think that's, in my opinion, is probably one of the most promising avenues for future research. It has also shown how diaspora settings can give birth to spaces for feminist resistance and for change. And so, yeah, this is a direction that I think would be really worth exploring further. So I will stop here because I've spoken a lot already.
Thank you, Élise. I guess that I'll pass it on to Mpumi. Mpumi, what does feminist peace research mean to you in light of your chapter?
Well, I'll start that I probably caused the most frustration. I remember one of my editors asking me, so when do you get to talking about peace and conflict studies? And I think it's because I find the whole idea and concept of peace so elusive. I'm old enough to remember apartheid. And so I saw the violence of apartheid. I was very young then. Violence is like energy. You see, it never ends. It just takes a different form. So the massive state-sanctioned violence ended with apartheid, there was all sorts of more interpersonal violence, more cultural, symbolic kind of violence, more epistemic violence. And so I feel immersed in violence. It becomes difficult for me to talk about what does peace mean because I don't have much in terms of lived experience to draw on. So when I was writing the chapter, for me, it was like the editors were really asking me to tap into my imagination and look at the violence and say, okay, the violence is like this. Talking about silencing in the context of my chapter. So silencing is the violence. And I speak about ontological dimension of violence. I talk about epistemic dimension of silencing, and I talk about the economic dimension of silencing. So I look at all these things, and I look at basically how all violence goes back to ontology, and how the very Black and women of human beings. So even though I cannot come up with a definition of peace, or to speak clearly about peace studies, I know that going towards peace means a recognition of humanity. So that is my starting point. What does it mean to recognize the other person as a human being on their own terms, rather than what other people see as an human being? And we know that human of the human. So I am actually at the starting point of feminist peace studies, whereas I think everybody else is a bit further on in their journey. I think I'll leave it at that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mpumi. This is really amazing. I think this is an incredible contribution, actually, to our handbook. I'll pass the baton to Maria.
Thank you, Catia, and thank you, everyone. Pumi, I think I'm joining you on your definition of peace. I think you raised very important insights on really not just about what feminist peace research is, but fundamentally, what do we mean by feminist peace? And I think in the chapter that I contributed to this fantastic handbook, and I'm very grateful that we are talking about this, I wrote a chapter on sexual health and world peace. And I think my starting point has been also interrogating what is the agenda, what is the alternative that feminist revolution and resistance is actually putting forward. And I've been reading a lot about critiques of how feminism has been co-opted, depoliticized, and because it has been unmoored from its political economy structural analysis, it was more easily mobilized to legitimize a range of other agendas. And so that question of what is our alternative, what is really feminist peace, matters, because we are at a point where with COVID and multiple crises occurring in all parts of the world, we are fundamentally questioning what is at stake with existence. How do we orient our politics and our activisms so that we're not just thinking about survival, but also of flourishing? And I come back to that point about humanity that Pumi raised, is that I think for me, peace is fundamentally about what does it mean to have a good life. And a feminist peace especially is about recognizing the centrality of human pleasure and desire. So in Sexual Health and World Peace, I talk about why is sexual health particularly among the most contested aspect of gender equality at the moment. And I map that in this chapter by looking at how with prevailing frameworks on global economy and security, we have been at a point where women's bodies are actually hypervisible. We have seen a feminization of economy and security, where women are in fact viewed as superheroines and as saving economy in the aftermath of crises. But that is in the broader context of everyday restrictions and violations to their sexual health. Even more, we're seeing this whole image of women as victims, the fetishization of sexual violence in conflict, or a range of representations about sexual relationships, and in a very negative way. But I think what is really radical about feminist peace research is that we are attentive to how sex and sexuality are important components to what makes a healthy and fulfilling life. And this goes beyond looking at human rights discourse into actually looking at political economy too. Because in order to have healthy and fulfilling sexual lives, we have to have the enabling conditions. And in analyzing conditions for peace and security, we need to talk about the material and ideological drivers and the continuities of these factors in conflict and disasters, in health pandemics, and how they're shaping the same drivers to the control of women's bodies. So finally, I think I build on and going back to that point about what is our feminist agenda, what is our feminist alternative, and what is really feminist peace. I draw on Bell Hook's work in feminist theory from margins to center, where she argues that it has been much easier actually to advocate for protection against women and so on, but we have not been as effective in actually re-articulating sexual freedom as part of a multi-issue feminist revolution. So I think an important starting point in order to think about a world and imagine, as Fumi mentioned, imagine a world where we do not really see violence as suffusing our everyday life and especially in times of crisis, is to start envisioning it in a very bodily sense. To start with how we can think about transforming society when we are recognizing that people have the right to define the relationships that they want to be in, how they see and envision love and intimacy. And this is even especially important in crisis settings where love, intimacy, and sexuality are viewed as luxuries. It is these are the very sites where there is the confluence of material and ideological factors that deny people's humanity. And we cannot talk about humanity without talking about sexuality, especially in times of crises. So I'll end it there and open it to the next set of questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Maria. I really like how all these contributions really point to we started this project without defining peace. The editors were really clear that we didn't want that because it is a moving target, right? All of us have different ideas about that. Swati, do you want to go next?
Thank you, Catia. Yes, thank you very much. And it's great to see everyone and to have this panel go through. It's a huge tribute to everyone who is part of this handbook, because it took a lot of effort and a lot of thinking, unlike many other projects that we end up being in. This was a very thoughtful project to have undertaken, and it was great to kind of refresh our memory about all the different chapters and what we've talked about. So I have written a chapter in this book called Famines, Slow Violence and Gendered Memorialization. And this, to me, is this chapter is co-authored with my wonderful colleague and friend Camila Orihuela. We worked together on a project at Gothenburg University, which is now expanded to many different parts of the world, where we are trying to argue that in post-famine conditions, it's very important to think about ways in which we imagine or frame issues of justice. And in some sense, some of the arguments that we have been stuck with or are kind of grappling with is this idea that certain kinds of violence has been actually erased out of the narratives that we have, prioritized, foregrounded. We have kind of forgotten that there are kinds of violence that also require our attention. And we all know that more people have died in famines and hunger deaths, mass hunger deaths than war. And this project itself is a culmination of wonderful conversations between two of us who come from different backgrounds. Me with my kind of IR training and interested in questions about violence and war on which I have done most of my previous work, and Camilla, who works on transitional justice. So for us, the entry point here is the idea of justice, because that to us is central to thinking, to any thinking around peace. How do we remember events of violence, particularly those acts of violence which are not spectacular, which are not immediate, which are not mediatized, which are highly feminized in the ways in which even little attention is paid to bodies, emaciated bodies of men and women, and particularly the depictions of household, which is so predominant when you think about famine. So we came with some of these concerns about how that violence gets portrayed. Firstly, how we frame it, how that is represented, and how we think about justice. You know, can people or groups of people or governments or organizations, who do we hold accountable to when we think about famines? So that kind of was the key concern. But I want to a little bit frame this in this context that, of course, as my colleagues have pointed out, that peace is not a universal pursuit, right? It does not conform to a universal understanding. There's no unanimous definition or singular phenomenon, not represented as a fixed or monolithic notion. And especially if you look at post-colonial societies, and for us, that has been really interesting to observe, particularly in famine context, that there are very many unresolved tensions and contradictions, even in terms of which violence is remembered, how it is mediated through issues of shame, national identity, and all of that. So those unresolved tensions and contradictions, to us, those are sites at which those frictions or struggles, that unstable equilibrium among several different contradictory forces of nation building, of nationalism, of gendered contributions to nationhood, to ideas of citizenship, at those junctures, those unstable equilibriums, the idea of peace for us begins. And this idea of peace is, of course, different from colonial logics of civilizing mission, which believed peace would follow assimilating diverse so-called archaic societies into European modernity. And the idea is to challenge that and say, peace means completely different things in different contexts. So we come from that kind of post-colonial critique of standard knowledge production in peace studies, its silences and erasures. So I just wanted to put that up front here in terms of thinking about famines. Coming to what we wanted to present, we wanted to argue in this that of course, taking from the point that Catia mentioned, that we were very interested in dismantling binaries in this handbook, and the binaries about war and peace. And this is where our work becomes important, that there are certitudes of violence, and there is also the violence of certitudes. We are so sure, we have hyper visibilized certain kinds of violence in feminist research, and perhaps we need to take the attention to other kinds of violence. Now, in this case for us, famine is an ongoing project. So this chapter emerges out of a very, very large project where we are studying famines in different parts of the world. We have many different scholars involved from Africa, Asia, Latin America, who are writing about the ways in which famine is memorialized, how we kind of talk about it as starvation deaths, as disasters. We talk about famines in terms of crisis. I mean, these are some of the words that are used. We don't talk about real accountability of people, and that it is an act of political violence. In that context, the paper actually explores the migration of 4,000 Irish women. This is a fieldwork that we undertook, and we've written about that in short, just how these women were taken from, when the great hunger occurred in Ireland, how they were taken to Australia. They migrated under a scheme, and these emaciated bodies of women, how they became then participants in the Australian nation building. And they are memorialized through different kinds of memorial rocks or, structures in Sydney, in Melbourne, and we write about it, which you will find in the book. But we were interested in how those memories are kept alive, and how issues of justice are finally framed. But again, I want to emphasize here that this is part of a very large project, and we were just very happy that we were given space for us to think about justice and to think about famines in this handbook. Normally, you wouldn't find a chapter like this, or so much emphasis on the continuum of violence and peace in any handbook. So we wanted to emphasize that. And finally, the idea here was to think through how not only how these commemorations occur, but what they do to people who are still grieving bodies, who are still thinking about the past, and who are still looking for justice. And in my own case, studying the Bengal famine in details, the 1942-43 famine, it's so interesting that the debates are rife now about where justice can come through. Can we ask for reparations? Can we think about reparative justice in the case of famines? So those questions for us guided this project. And we just want to say that we were just, this idea of erasures of certain kinds of violence. And we are not just arguing that famines are, the only thing. There are other spotlights that perhaps we could focus on. There's more in the chapter. We'd be happy to get some feedback and for you to read it, but I think I'll stop here. Yeah.
Thank you, Swati. I love the certitude. There's the certitudes of violence and the violence of certitudes. We talked a lot about this when we were writing our introductions as well. I will close where we began by asking Annick, who has written the chapter on genealogies, to talk about her vision of peace, feminist peace research in view of your chapter.
Yeah, thank you, Catia. I hope you can all hear me now. Yeah, much better. Okay, excellent. I switched to a different mic. Yeah, so I kind of love the Feminist Peace Research Network. Can I say that? It's just been such a great journey these last couple of years, exactly, to sort of really engage with so much excellent work that, as Tarja and others were mentioned at the beginning, has sort of been written out, silenced, forgotten, dismissed. There is such a long age that we know about from women, but also feminists that are not women, and for a really long time. And of course, some of this is really hard to recover because, as we know, not always has it been written down or saved or taken seriously as even pertaining to anything we might call like scholarly work or research. And so some of us have also been writing about this in other pieces. Highly recommend the Unruly Wives piece. I'll post it again on Twitter later for people to find. It's also open access, where we try to sort of think about other archives and all of that work that people in the network have done and that I have also contributed to has sort of flown into this chapter, where I try to think about genealogies and feminist peace research in sort of three different ways. So on the one hand, I look back and I try to consider, what different starting points are there or could there be for thinking about feminist peace research? Like when we tell these stories of how a field or a sort of strand of thinking comes together, where we start and who we include in that starting point becomes so really important. So I try to look at different starting points and sort of speculate about what it might look like if we started in different places than the ones that we are used to started in. I then sort of focused a little bit on the UN Decade for Women from 1975 to 1985, because that seemed to be a moment where there was quite a flourishing engagement of scholars with questions of peace, making linkages also between sort of racism, anti-capitalism, and also environmental issues. And so sort of things that we're very much talking about. And then finally, I sort of jump to today and think about, well, what happened that feminist
peace research sort of became a thing that was only talked about on some margins here or there. And I identify sort of the rise of other projects like critical security studies, but also feminist security studies as taking over some of that energy. And that's maybe also where my own sort of interest or sort of move, I don't know if I moved over to peace research, but anyway, sort of why I like this project so much is because, of course, many probably associate me with feminist security studies, but one of the frustrations that I had there or have there is that it's not political enough for me. It doesn't have that sort of commitment that I see, or some of it doesn't, some of it does, but the commitment that I feminist peace research having, which is to think about really peace as the sort of top thing on the agenda. And we don't know exactly what that means. I don't think we have, I think it's very much evident also in this project, but we sort of have it as a goal, or not just as a goal, as something that we're also sort of thinking about in the present. And I think that the people who've already talked sort of really point to that it's about the everyday, it's about finding peace in the mundane, it's about the bodily, it's about sort of the various things that are happening right now. And to me also, it doesn't necessarily make it, that's not entirely different from also thinking about peace as utopia. And some of you know that I'm really fascinated by the work on utopia, for example, that Bowling and others have done, because the imagination that Mpumi also talked about, I think, is so important. So we're sort of both looking at the everyday and what is happening right now, and what are the elements in our daily lives that are peaceful or could be peaceful or should be peaceful, and also imagining these alternative futures sort of at the same time. And that to me is also sort of a feminist thing, that we're kind of always holding these tensions, that we're sort of playing with them, and sort of trying to find in those tensions new ideas. So that's, I think, probably all I'll say right now. And I know we're going to have a second, so I'll say a little bit more then.
Thank you, Annick. I was thinking that for the next question, we're going to go a little bit less structured, and I invite also Tarja in her role as editor to also intervene whenever, and you guys can all unmute friends. You all can unmute yourselves when you want to say something. But the next question is about the challenges that we faced. I would like us to talk a little bit about the challenges that we faced in regards to, for example, the vocabulary used, or citation politics, or what some of it you've already talked about, what we mean by peace, or what about the risks of doing some more epistemic violence in our own writing. And I'll mute myself so that you can unmute yourselves.
Well, I can start if you want. I think what for me on the working on diasporas, I was really struggling with the risk of creating more violence towards diasporas by actually talking about violence in diaspora settings. And I think this is a big risk, because when you look at a lot of what has been produced about women in the diaspora, for instance, a lot of this perpetuates, colonial stereotypes that I've already talked about earlier, and all these Orientalist tropes. And I think it's an exercise that you have to maintain all the time, that you think about, okay, if I'm saying this, then I have to be careful to also say this in order to counterbalance and to show that, the patterns of violence that you see, of everyday violence, for instance, that you see in diaspora settings, that they are very much connected to, for instance, broader patterns of discrimination, power imbalances in the broader society where those diasporas live. So yeah, so I think that for me that was probably one of the big risks, and I assume for many of my co-authors as well in this handbook, that this risk of doing more violence by talking about violence regarding specific groups, somehow perpetuates that violence, or at least a type of violence.
Maybe I could also say something, and this relates, of course, partly to this handbook, but also to my own research. I have found it difficult to start to talk about, and I think some of you or many of you have mentioned this already, kind of mundane practices of peace. Because even in the context of peace research, it's often thought that, oh, okay, there she is talking about something which is irrelevant, personal, doesn't have contextualization, omits power, omits structural things. So I feel that I have encountered those type of things, but for me also this handbook was a good thing and good thing to edit and read all the chapters, because yeah, I think I learned a lot about that actually when we are talking, and which I think I have argued also, that when we are talking about these mundane practices of peace or everyday peace, embodied practices of violence and peace, we are always talking about at the same time economical structures, disadvantages, vulnerabilities, structural issues, power issues.
Yeah, I think I could go next. Is that okay, Catia?
Catia is muted, so you have to just go.
Yeah, okay. So I think it's a good question to reflect on this, because not only was I involved in the editorial process of the decision making, the editing, etc., but I thinking through this violence of famines, and I think one of the things that inspires me to think about this is also the kinds of discussions which have argued that while it is okay to pay attention to epistemic erasures and epistemic violence, but also that we need to do the body counts. There are certain ways in which we also invisibilize the idea of actual body counts. And these are conversations that are taking place in certain decolonial, post-colonial, circles about how perhaps we might, in our discussions of epistemic violence, we need to go back to thinking about bodies, right? So in some sense, we have normalized and masculinized what we know about violence. And in that sense, it's very important to think about what bodies, the exclusions and inclusions of violence in particular, when and what bodies are outside it, inserted within it, significantly gendered. Why is it important to talk about violence in relation to where the violence occurs and what counts as violence, who gets to speak about it? And this was important for us because in famine research that we find, except for the Irish famine, perhaps the Holodomor, perhaps one or two other famines, a large number of famines in the post-colonial world have just been silenced. And if you look at the figures, they are staggering number of human lives and the cost of those famines. So to us, the question was, where is this silence coming from? And what does it do to have a public discourse, which is so much about media attention to, immediate acts, the blood and the gore and the rupture of everyday life, and the routine sensationalization of certain bodies. So when you think about famines as slow, unaesthetic, ordinary deaths of ordinary lives over a period of time, I don't know, I'm sure that we've all gone through pangs of hunger, but what does it mean to die of hunger? It's kind of a deeply reflective, moment to think about what these people may have gone through and how do we reimagine justice in that context. So I think those concerns about what we, how we talk about violence, how, and of course that all of this has implications to how we imagine peace, right? Thank you.
I can just jump quickly if that's okay, because it builds on what Swati is saying. I think I'm also, the difficulty for me also in thinking about bodies and particularly the language in sexual and reproductive health research on bodily autonomy and the right to self-determination at the very individual level is that as Swati mentioned, I think there's a lot of also of the contestations around what bodies and which bodies. But I'm also very concerned that especially in the context of COVID, that progressive language of, you know, critical feminist attention to bodies are being co-opted and repurposed in the language of my body, my choice. And that links with, you know, resistance against vaccines, resistance against masking, and questioning of expertise and whose knowledge are actually counted in the decision making over peace and security. So I think there are fundamental links between bodies, knowledge, expertise, and again, I've this is I think the second time now that we've raised the concept of imagination. If we're really thinking of decolonizing our understanding of peace and security, we have to have bodies there. But also, it's important that we rethink again the bodies, because the bodies are connected to particular perspectives and knowledges, and so there are intimate and fundamental links, but also that we should not be complacent in assuming that it's only progressive and critical and feminist scholars that are interested in bodies, because other anti-feminist forces are also thinking about this and articulating it in the language that we have, or as feminists and human rights activists have used. So I think that tension of how our own activisms and analysis are being resignified for very anti-feminist gains is something that I'm very much struggling with, especially because I do believe in the importance of bodily autonomy for feminist peace.
May I jump in? In the context of the work that I do, and I didn't mention before that the chapter is an extension of my research on rape law reform in post-apartheid South Africa. So the issue there becomes how women of color have been rendered invisible in the process of rape law reform, a rape law reform that claims to be empowering them. And one of the problems, an enduring problem that I am encountering in my research, is the issue of research ethics. Research ethics requires that, it requires anonymity. And so I'm in a catch-22 situation where these women I'm interviewing are often women who have worked extensively as activists or as scholars / academics who are not getting the space, they're not coming through in the Google searches, and now in silence how they've been rendered invisible. And then once again, I have to keep them anonymous. So on one hand, the anonymity protects them, because obviously when these things come out, there's going to be backlash. There's going to be backlash from research academic institutions. There's going to be backlash from international donors. But we're continuing to not tell the identities or reveal their identities means that I also perpetuate their invisibility. So that is one of the conflicts in terms of perpetuating epistemic violence as well on my part unintentionally. That is what I am encountering at the moment. That's what I wanted to say.
I'll jump in.
If I can jump. Huh?
Oh, sorry. Annick, please.
Yeah, go, Itzi. You can go first. I'll go because it fits quite nicely with what Nompumelelo was just saying about this question of whose stories sort of we tell, and can we tell them with sort of their names attached to them. Like, do we remember whose stories they are, or do they just become these anonymous stories? So I think this is sort of something that, at least, I mean, I grapple with always, but also in the chapter on genealogies, this is sort of, you know, trying to cut it down to a very small, I can't remember now if we had 5,000 words or something, but, you know, we didn't have very many words, and you're trying to capture a whole thing, and how do you try to do justice to the sort of stories that you know have already been written out multiple times before. So trying to dig up the materials and trying to even know where to look, because sometimes the silence is so pervasive that you can't even tell where you should look. So I think that this is sort of a struggle that I find in general, but also in sort of trying to sort of recover and sort of recognize and credit those who have spoken sort of about all these things before us, because it's amazing when you go back and you read this archive of feminist engagements with peace and violence. All the things have, like, as I was reading, I felt like all the things have been said before, and they have apparently all been forgotten. And here we are saying the same things again. And why do we keep doing this? And of course, it's not just us, right? There's a lot of structural factors that make this happen. But that's sort of, so in that sense, there's sort of also doing this within the academy and within the rules that sort of Mpumi just mentioned, I think is a really important thing to think about. And how do we break out of that, if possible, is something I struggle with. I'll leave it there. Itzi.
Thank you, Annick. I wanted to mention a couple of things that I might move the discussion a little bit from the direction it was taken, but I wanted to mention two factors that shaped Iker and my chapter, and how we, or at least I, participated in this book, right? Because it kind of has been a life lesson for me in relation to the coherence between what we do, what we research, and then our everyday life as academics and researchers, right? And the moment in which I co-wrote this chapter arrived in a kind of difficult moment in which it was pre-COVID times. It was December and April, if I'm not remembering wrong. But we were also having quite difficult health issues with my daughter at home. So I was all the times late. I was the pain in the ass for the editors. And I really felt safe. I really felt protected and taken care of by the editors. And this was something that I wanted to bring to the discussion too, because we always, and I feel at least here, or at least at my university, we do speak very easily about feminist research, feminist teaching, being feminists, and so on and so forth. But then how do we bring that down to our everyday life and how we act with each other, right? So in that sense, I really felt safe and felt taken care of by you. So I wanted to mention that on the one side. And on the other side, I also wanted to bring the discussion to the citation politics, right? Or to the subject of citation politics, because it's something that I've been struggling with for a long time. Iker and I both have been talking about that for a long time. And we've been trying to be kind of open about it and radical about it, right? Because at least here, we've been encountered with a lot of resistance and a lot of opposition when we've been carefully choosing who to cite, when and where, right? And trying to cite more women, more critical voices, more feminist voices, and so on. And the resistances we have found have been quite visible and difficult to deal with. So when we started to write this chapter, we were kind of, we automatically wrote what we were supposed to write. And then we had to think about it and say, oh, be careful, look what we're writing, who we are citing. And then there were the editors too, who were there to remind us that, right? But how easily we forget about that. At least it happened to us, and it will happen again, I'm sure. But how easily we tend to forget who we cite, when, why, and where, right? And how it is a constant struggle of reminding yourself that every single day and in every text you write, right?
Thank you. One thing that I really appreciate what you just said, Itziar, and because to me the process of this handbook was really also living as meant real living and relating to each other, authors and editors, as if we were also living in the world that we were imagining, right? However that imagination was, and I appreciate that you made yourself all of you made yourselves vulnerable and honest about, you know, our own failings, and there are many. I even during this the process of editing this handbook, I feel that there are many, but the difficulties of living a feminist life, as Sarah Ahmed wants to say, right? Says. I would ask all of you again to do some more reflection briefly, because I really would like everybody to who is listening in to have a chance to ask their own questions. But I would like us to talk about where do you see the future of feminist peace research now? Where are we going, or where should we going from now on? If this handbook is the opening and the beginning rather than the end of our project. And again, sorry, just to stress again, a quick answer.
I can maybe say just a quick sentence about this. I think I was super happy when I saw the program of this conference, because actually feminist peace seems to be everywhere. So you know, it's a good thing because it's taken up by others. So yeah, Tarja, sorry, I cut you.
Yeah, no problem. What I wanted to say that I was reflecting this from the perspective of our students, MA students, because we have a international master's program in peace research in our institute, and one topic which or one approach they are particularly interested is or two things really: decolonizing knowledge and co-production of knowledge. So right now we have a couple of MA students who are writing their thesis in the tradition of co-production of knowledge, and they write their thesis with Sami indigenous activists. And they are fully immersed in that type of knowledge production. So I see one kind of future there, that the next generation will engage more in that.
I can be super brief. I can say I think the feminist peace research future is bright. I mean, I think look at what we have sort of achieved just in a couple of years of bringing people together to have these conversations. So yay.
Yeah, I'll go brief again. Yeah, I think, yeah, all of us involved in this collaboration know, and given the kind of feminist backlash that we are watching, different ways in which we are feeling dispirited and we are feeling less energized. I think these spaces creating these collaborative spaces is the only way to go. And I want to re-emphasize that when I started on this project, I had not worked with my colleagues here. You may have watched us in social media and all together, but I've never worked with these wonderful editors and the authors, most of them. And to me, that itself, that creating opening spaces where we can do this collective thinking. So that's one. And my final point would be that the only way I see, and that is what got me into famine research and other ways of thinking about violence, is to disrupt this kind of very normalization of war and violence and everything that we think we have a theoretical hold on. And I think we need to question that, because that kind of normalization of knowledge itself is a problem. Like for example, with famine, so it's a disaster, it's a crisis, it's everything else but not an act of political violence on humans. And I think if we start busting those myths, I think we might be able to get a full grasp of where peace can come through. Peace is it's a process. It's not the end product. It's not the end of a journey. It's very much a process, and we are all part of it. Thank you.
I always tell my students that peace is a verb, not a noun. I see that Maria wanted to talk.
Yeah, I think mine is also just very briefly, but I think as much as I also agree that we need to have analytically a very diverse and pluralist understanding of peace, I think politically we have to, and it's, I think, the urgent thing that we need to do as feminists, linking our research with our practice, is to really integrate our different understandings. So analytically, we disaggregate and draw on pluralist, eclectic traditions, methods, and understandings of peace. But I think politically, to move forward and for a future where feminism cannot be resignified, and in the context of backlash and reversals and contestations, I think it is important that we know politically what is our agenda, what does feminist peace look like, and and as the discussions we've had in this panel and in the book, we have a lot of ideas to draw from, and we've long argued in IR, feminist and peace and conflict, that it's not just the absence of war. But if that's not it, what is it then? So I think it is the urgent purpose politically to define what is it that we actually mean, and what is the goal, what is the future alternatives that we are imagining.
I think that joining with what you said, Maria, I think that bringing to the center the concept of coherence is important too. I mean, what are we talking about when we talk about feminist peace research, and what does this mean in our work, in our everyday life, in our research, right? How do we bring this to all the aspects of what we do?
Is Mpumi still here?
Yeah, I think going back to Tarja said, it's just about hierarchies of knowledge and confronting those hierarchies and trying to dismantle them, and just giving or recognizing these languages, these knowledges and languages and everything in their own right, and allowing them to shine without having to appropriate them, because academia does encourage us to appropriate other people's knowledges, because we're always looking for something novel and something new. That's all I wanted to say.
I think that this is as good a place to end as we can get, and I will open it to the participants for any questions. You can write them in the chat and I'll read them, or I think that Megan would be ready to unmute you. Question mark, Megan?
Yeah, so if they raise their hand using the raise their hand feature, they will then be able to unmute themselves fairly easily. And I can help if anyone does have trouble with that.
Maybe we can also invite comments and not just questions.
That's a great idea. I tend to restrain myself from speaking because I try to practice this in my class, counting to 10, the silence, because people sometimes are shy about intervening. So I want to give the space for the thinking. Yes, Shweta, please come in. You are one of our authors. So Shweta Singh, if Megan, if you can help unmute Shweta.
Yeah, one moment. I'm making her a panelist so she can turn on her camera and speak freely if she would like.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Megan. And wonderful to see you all. I have to say, this is a fabulous group of editors that I've worked with. They pushed us very hard. And actually, and very honestly, things that I would not have thought about, I was pushed to think about some of those questions, even in my own research. And one of the things that I thought I'll bring to the table was, what do we recognize as feminist peace research? For instance, in my own work on feminist peace education, for me, sometimes what is not recognized as a vocabulary of feminist peace education is actually feminist peace education. For instance, for us in the Global South. So I was looking at activists, at scholars who would conventionally not fit into the label of feminist peace researchers, but they were actually doing feminist peace research. So I think for me, it was very reflective to go back to ideas and to look at sources that have never been part of the feminist peace research literature. So for instance, I would go back to Savitribai Phule and think about how was the idea, for instance, of critical feminist peace pedagogy embedded in her work in the context of India, in the phase, in the context of how she was shaping, for instance, the intersections of caste, class, in the context of emancipatory, pedagogy that we are talking about. So I think one of the things that I just thought I would put on was this handbook, as both Swati and Catia and Élise and Tarja, I think what everyone, it really pushed you to think about processes that had been invisibilized. I think to me, truly, it was a reflexive process. And so congratulations once again. Good to see you all on this panel, but just a thought that came to my mind. Yeah, thank you.
If I can comment on Shweta's comment, this goes back maybe to one of the earlier questions that was asked regarding the challenges and the obstacles. I struggle also with this, how do we call what? And in particular, paying attention to the fact that in some traditions / countries, contexts, some feminists do not want, so people that we would call feminists do not want to use this term. They do not want to use this language, and they really refuse it, either because it would be politically dangerous for them or for other reasons that are their own. And so this is also something that I struggle with, because I think we have to be careful also not to commit epistemic violence, by pushing this onto them.
Yeah. And there's a resistance to the language of feminist peace research. We need to recognize that resistance too.
And yes, and yet at the same time, I also think that maybe Annick will not like me for this, but part of that resistance has been the feminization of the idea of peace. Right? And so we turn, all the feminists in IR turn to security studies. And peace and security are two very gendered terms in a way. I think this is, obviously I'm not the first one to say this, as Ann Tickner said it before as well. I have a couple of comments, and then I'll have Zara talk. But Jess Poon, thank you, Jess. She says, I don't have a question, but just wanted to say this has been a great set of discussions. And even though this isn't my field of expertise, this has been eye-opening. I've loved learning from you all. And I'm, Zara, do you want to talk? Do you want to say something? And also Amia Agarwal says, absolutely wonderful discussion. I don't have comments, but learned a lot and still absorbing and reflecting. Thank you so much. Zara, please, Megan, if you can unmute Zara, I would appreciate it.
Yes, one moment.
Thank you.
Zara, you should be able to speak for the moment.
Zara, you can go ahead. Unmute yourself and you can speak.
Yeah, that's right. Hi, everybody. It's very nice that I listening to this panel. I also see my lovely teacher here. I want to, yeah, I want to say that something continues what Élise said about the language and feminist peace culture. One important issue that, for example, in our culture and in our language, Farsi, and we don't have equivalent words for feminist. And when we talk about, for example, feminist peace, what is a very new issue in the countries such as Iran, we activists and scholars are confronted with a very harsh reactions that what do you want to talk about? And we should explain then that we are talking the everyday practices and something like this and want to shed light from the other perspective on the practices, but they don't understand it and just took to the words of feminist. And I just thinking that maybe some days we can just create some words that have similar feelings and attitudes to feminist peace, but with another words, because it's a very hard situation to explain it to what it actually means. It's a notion that I want to say.
Yeah, I think you are absolutely right, Zahra. And Zahra is our student, and she has made wonderful research on interviewing a huge amount of Iranian female activists and doing life history, collecting life history narrative of those activists. So I assume she's one of the only persons in the world who has had access to those people. But that is exactly, I think, what Élise was saying, that there is a danger that we impose something, things and words and theories even, to our kind of people with whom we are working.
Yeah, if I can come in as well. I think the question of language is so interesting because even, sort of quote unquote simple things like terminology, gender doesn't translate into so many languages, or it has, it might have different kinds of meanings. And then if we're moving sort of beyond that to maybe think about intersectionality, which is of course something that many of us are thinking about integrating in our work, how does that travel? Like, how do all these concepts travel and translate? And what happens when you take a concept like intersectionality, which is, you know, created or emerges out of the very particular context of the sort of Black experience in the US, and then you move it to other contexts, and you try to use it to describe and analyze and think about these other contexts. And I think that in itself is a sort of huge project to think about. But I also think at the same time that feminist researchers with our sort of deep reflection on methodology and the political nature of all creation of knowledge and power relationships embedded in knowledge and all of these questions that we spend so much time on, ethics and research and so forth, are probably, you know, in some way best suited to actually answer those questions as well, to really think through them. I'm always struck by how many of our feminist colleagues have really thought long and hard about all of these questions, which of course is another strength, I think, of this approach. But so much these questions of how do we even translate some of the key terms that we try to use, and then do this when we can't even agree on what they mean in English or whatever language it is that we're using. It gets complicated, but maybe also it's another one of these spaces where in this constant negotiation, we are, as we're having these conversations, we're actually sort of bringing things to awareness and learning new things about what we're thinking, what we thought we knew, and then also like where we need to think harder. Oh, hi, nice to see you.
Hi, Zahra. I have a question from Gunhild, who has raised their hand. Megan, maybe you can unmute Gunhild as well.
She is unmuted.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for both the discussion, and also thank you very much to the editors for the patience you showed with waiting for me in my chapter in this contribution. And I was listening to some of the other about sort of the struggles around feminism, and that's actually what my chapter brought me to, because I was writing about militarism and in the ways in which feminism had been employed or even attempted to sort of take a look at certain things happening in Afghanistan. I looked at the intervention in Afghanistan, and I've experienced something very interesting for myself, and that was kind of fighting with feminism, and not fighting with feminism as a whole, but fighting with some of the ways in which feminism was employed. My chapter the chapter title is a bit flippant, but purposefully so, because at the end of the day, looking at the ways in which feminism was articulated or operationalized, not just by militaries, I might add, in the Afghanistan context, at the end of the day, I didn't really see much difference between militarist kind of ways of thinking and even some of the feminist ways of thinking. And this is what I mean by that is the ways in which power was and continues to be affected, the way it was also operational. And thanks to many really good interventions by the editors, as I was struggling to make my chapter make sense, was taking a look at the ways in which feminism engaged in colonizing practices in Afghanistan as well. You know, so while on the one hand claiming, and again, I'm not speaking just on behalf of like sort of like, oh, those nasty military types, but the ways in which what feminism could bring to the table could also silence others in these communities, and very intersectional approach, so to speak. So this is a rather blathering way of saying that I found actually the exercise I experienced with writing this chapter extremely helpful. I haven't really come to any conclusions though, but it really helped raise some questions and also make me wonder about the translatability of what I was doing. If I were to show this to somebody else, someone who's a practitioner in a different field, or an academic even in a different field, would they get it? Would they get what I'm talking about? And how can I make this more accessible? So I was thinking about accessibility too during this process. And this has also been something very relevant in a new thing that I've been writing, and it's taking a look at gender equality in the Arctic. And that is a very fascinating experience because the extent to which the language that we're using a lot in feminist peace research and feminist security studies is just not completely unfamiliar to people who are doing research in the Arctic. And I'm not talking just about the natural sciences. I also mean in the social sciences. So I'm very curious about that whole kind of what we're doing understandable and accessible so that others will sort of, you know, the lights will go on and they're like, yeah, but of course. Because I find that struggle continues on, the communication with those who don't focus on this particular topic. So anyways, that's all I want to say. And a big thank you very much to the editors for amazing support for my contribution. So that's it. Thanks.
I have to say, we love our authors. It was such a learning process. So thank you, Gunhild, which I failed to mention that you were also one of the authors. What you said about communicating to others what we're doing really resonates with me. I'm writing right now. I'm not writing. I've been invited to write a piece on a colleague who's actually a linguist. He's a translator. And he's retiring, so they asked me to write. And in that process, I didn't know what to write about. But when talking to him, I realized that all of us have to really, for us to communicate feminist knowledge to people that don't do feminism, but also any act of talking across disciplinary boundaries is an act of translation. And what does it take for us to be understood, or for us to understand others that come from totally different traditions? That's really something that has been puzzling me these couple of days. Maybe I should talk to you, Gunhild. We should have a chat on this. Sorry. I think that someone wanted, maybe that Swati wanted to intervene here as well.
Yes,
Swati, do you want to?
Thank you, Catia. Good points raised by both of you. And I think we have been talking about what knowledge is, or what, coming back to citations, like what gets cited, what canons are built even in feminism. And I think we are all guilty of that for a very long time. I know that most of us are becoming more and more aware in our citation practices, but I think for a very long time we hadn't thought through. And one troubling thing for me is not just that as feminists we say we are self-reflexive, and we're not. And I think we stay committed to that. We talk about it, but in our own practices, how we do it is really critical. But I want to emphasize this, that several times when I'm attending conferences or events in Asia, Africa, India, anywhere, it's interesting in conversations with colleagues, like how much they don't cite the people from the region, or I don't even want to call it a region, but from within the communities from which this work comes, right? The rich work. And they are so invested in citing most of us based in Western locations. And to me, talk about challenge, that is the most heartbreaking thing that I find. I was at a conference with Shweta, who will remember, and I brought this up, that every single panelist in India was talking about all of us in various forms, whether we take the form of Enlo or Tiknar or Catia or Annick or me or Shweta or whoever, it was just us. And I thought, my God, the rich work that is there in the country. And that leads me to vocabulary. That one of the things that one young scholar had once told me, that I don't want to cite scholars in India because they don't do feminist IR. And I keep repeating this story because it tells us that there is a problem with how we have constructed a discipline, sub-discipline, and then who's included, who do you cite? I think we have to break those barriers very much so, because I think it's extremely damaging to the really rich work that is available out there in many different fields. Thank you.
I want to touch on this, Swati, because I agree. And yet, I think I go back to Itzi's comments at the beginning, how difficult it is, because it's not only about our willingness, but there's a whole set of systems of power that regulate who even gets to the search engines, right? And not to mention who gets published where, but even the search engines don't show up necessarily. Even in the search engines, it's difficult to find the different voices, and all the ones that are most cited all appear in there. It's not only a question of choice, it's also a question of power and structures.
No, absolutely. And on that quick point, that women of color, even if they are outside academia in Global South, even if they work in the North, they are far less cited. If you just look at Google Scholar, many of the people doing the research are never cited. I one day sat and did that research. It's really, yes, I agree with that point. No dispute there.
Yes, and then the politics of the reviewing process, right? That, if you, but then there's the word limit. So you have to select the citation. All of that really it's a complicated system, a structured system of power.
Yeah, I just would like to intervene on this because with a personal anecdote. So 2 weeks ago, I withdrew an article from a prestigious journal because I was asked by one of the reviewers to, obviously the reviewer was a feminist, I hope not in this panel, but the feminist was asking me to quote, so I'm not going to name names, but white female feminist scholars with, in parentheses, their institution. So I had Yale, I had Harvard, I had, all the big institutions. And I had, on purpose in my paper, quoted feminist scholars from the Global South. And I was requested to change that. And I think that there is a big discussion that we also need to have, between us, that we have to stop. It's not just stopping quoting the global North white males, it's also stopping always quoting the usual suspects, global North female scholars. And I think because this is really problematic for wonderful research that is done on the global South, and we could keep quoting those, female academics who write those books sometimes without, and this is also a discussion I remember that we've had, without ever setting foot, sometimes on the places where they pretend to do research on. And so I think this is really also a self-criticism, and we should be self-reflective about this too, and pay attention also to this.
This is also, I think, a pedagogical issue, that it is also a matter how we teach our own students to do this things. If our curriculum is filled with standardized stuff, of course they will learn certain ways of citing and certain kind of histories of disciplines. So I think we might need to take that into account when we are planning curriculum.
Yeah, and can I add to this as well? One of the things that was quite clear when we were writing the Unruly Wives article as well, is that, there are things that are somewhat citable because maybe they have actually been published somewhere. And then there are things that are, by at least some of the metrics that we use for citations, not really citable, right? And how do we cite these other kinds of knowledges, and how do we become open? I think maybe what you were just talking about, Tarja, as well, we have, I think, opened up in some ways to maybe using literature or poetry or images, but there's so many other kinds of knowledge that are often not valued as, you know, real knowledge. Or and I think having that conversation also in relation to what you were just saying, Élise, about you know, are we inventing sort of the new standard canon that then, you know, everybody has to cite those people, you know, before maybe they all had to cite Cohen and now they all have to cite, you know, Pickner or whatever. Nothing against, but like, you know, then like, how do we keep it sort of open to, like, I really want to also think about the kind of knowledge that's more, you know, sort of the in between, the intangible. Can we cite this? How do we give credit to where we are learning these things? It's just not always from a book or from you know, that sort of traditional citable material. So thinking out loud.
Catia, did you want to make a point? I think. Didn't you?
Not really. So I posted it on the comment because there's someone that I know has launched this initiative that it's called the Global Decenter. And this is about building a platform that brings scholars with committed across the world, committed to producing new knowledge and different epistemologies, and to work collaborative across disciplines and across and also challenging these kinds of hegemonic practices that we have in the academy. I put the link there, but I don't want to take space here. I would like others to. We have 7 minutes, so maybe time for another question. Okay, we have a question for Emma Fredriksson. In regards to what I'm reading, in regards to what has been said about the use of the term feminist and peace, I want to ask what you see are the potential challenges and benefits of using these concepts as feminist peace scholars, and maybe particularly for junior scholars. And also in times of backlash, how do we frame our research and are framed by others, and how it might affect our way of contributing to political change? What strategies can we use? This is a big, huge question. Thank you, Emma. Who wants to tackle it?
Okay, I'm not sure that I have an answer to this, but I think like sometimes we just borrow terms. I mean, in the sense that we don't critically engage with it about how we are. And I don't think there can be consensus on either peace or even on feminism, I would argue. In fact, one of the points that I make is in another write-up is how in many parts of the world we are still using traditional understandings of women's studies and, you know, social reforms to talk about changes initiated through feminist activism and research. So I have seen, my experience has been that people on the ground, by that I mean activists and scholars really out in the field doing the research, I think they are very smart. They know what, that is why we need to diversify what we read and who we engage with and what we cite. And I think people are adapting themselves very differently in different contexts to this moment of backlash. Even backlash has become very like a popular word, like populism, which I don't like to use actually. But I think it's important to know that in various contexts, there is a lot of creativity that is coming through, and I think there's a lot of feminist thinking on the ground of even using feminism. Do remember that in post-colonial context, this debate is not settled of what feminism means. I know that I would probably disagree with some of the discussions that we had in the morning, some of the morning sessions, but I don't think that the aversion is to feminism. It's to certain kinds of feminism. I think there's a lot of productive debate about what feminism does in post-colonial context. Why is it considered a Western imposition? I think there are those rich histories also that we have to consider instead of saying we can wipe it off. So I think in brief, I think people are there doing this hard labor of thinking and using concepts, and perhaps we can collaborate and we can expand our networks a little bit. That's the one thing that comes to mind. Thanks.
I think that I also wanted to add just a few words about junior scholars, because for junior scholars, this is a really kind of almost existential question, in the sense that what are the practices that would get them a job or get them promotion? And this, again, it's not really dependent necessarily on them and on the courage. So it's also it's on us more senior people to make space for those junior scholars, because it's a risk. It can be a risky move to identify with feminism, identify with feminist peace research, not citing the usual suspects and all of that. So it's the strategies are, for me, what worked for me, and I cannot say. I think that it would be an advantage to find yourself as many allies as you can, to network, and not just network in the kind of neoliberal sense of, create your network and in a utilitarian way, but also really to create your support network that can nurture you as well in a very personal way, and that can help you devise the best strategies for getting employment, for getting promotion, et cetera, et cetera. Because these are tricky times to navigate. And for political change, I am not really that optimistic on, or I think that there's very few of us in the academia that contribute to political change through our work, through our academic work. But we don't only wear the academic hat. None of us, right? All of us have multiple identities and roles and positionalities. And on my end, that's the activism for me. That's participating in networks. For example, in my neighborhood, mutual aid network during COVID, or in WILP, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Pumi, I'll leave it to you to close, since you have something to say in the chat, and Annick.
I didn't really want to talk, just to mainstream academy, that's when you get ignored or pigeonholed. So you're a person that speaks about women's issues, and that's it. And we know that women's issues are not what is considered to be the central issue of political science where I'm at the moment. So it's very much an issue of, well, if you want to be taken seriously, then you must take that masculine sort of stance within political science. So,
Indeed, Annick, I guess that you have the last words, because I think that this is the end of our panel.
Okay, famous last words, maybe, hopefully not. No, Emma, we can talk about this more, actually, but also I think for everyone, I don't know that it has to be this fixed right? And I think that this is sort of something as junior scholars, sometimes we have this, way back when, you have this idea that you need to figure out where exactly do I fit in, and actually I think it's a little bit more fluid. Like even though Catia was saying earlier, Annick, you in feminist security studies, but I still, sort of identify with, contribute to, get associated with variety of these kind of boxes, and you can also use those boxes strategically, but I think it depends a little bit on where you feel at home in terms of your thinking, where you're finding the conversations that both sort of support you but also challenge you, and that make you, I mean, for me it's always like who is making me think harder, and that space also shifts. So I think that's sort of a little bit my advice, that it's also possible to move around a little bit depending on which audience you're speaking, and it's almost necessary to do that. And totally, like, just the word feminism anywhere in there will already, for some people, mean that they don't want to talk to you, and their loss, I guess. Famous last words.
Okay, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Megan, and vicariously also Celia and Carrie, the organizers. And Megan, you've been fabulous. I really appreciate it. And everybody who was here, and your comments, Lisa McLean, who just posted a comment, I really appreciate. And to our authors and my co-conspirators, editors, thank you. It was just an amazing experience, and I treasure really your friendship and our work together. And see you in other panels. I want to make a pitch for Yolanda Bauke, a plenary later, right? Okay, I think that's okay. I don't know exactly what time, but I think it's 8 p.m. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
I'm gonna say one more thing. If there was a lot of conversations,
Sorry.
The stage is open. If you want to continue these conversations and discussions without being interrupted by another panel, you can always join the networking stage and continue to have these discussions and ask questions. So that is always an option. So have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you at some more panels.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.